Welcome to the Paul Wallis channel. Today we're looking at Plato and ghosts. Now, just as a disclaimer, I'm going to be sharing with you some experiences that have been shared with me by viewers of the Paul Wallis channel. These are personal experiences, and I'm sharing them not in any way to try and prove anything, but simply to let you know the kind of experiences that people are having around you and around me, so that we can pool each other's experiences and have a think about what these things might mean. Now, Plato wrote in the 5th to 4th century BCE. He's one of the most important thinkers of all time. And even though he was writing best part of half a millennium before Christianity, his thought was really foundational to what many of the early church fathers believed about the world at large. Many of the Apostle Paul's most famous quotes are actually Plato quotes, where just a word has been altered here and there to turn it into something new. There's a great British philosopher who said you can summarize the whole of the Western tradition of philosophical thought as no more than a series of footnotes to Plato, and nobody disagreed with him. That's how important he is. Now, in some senses, he was a scientist because he built his conclusions one logical step at a time based on things we can all observe. At the same time, he based some of his information on ancestral information and on personal experience. And it was really from that logic and personal experience that he got into the topic of ghosts. He argued that we are conscious beings before we are material beings. He argued that consciousness preceded the material universe. And he had come to the conclusion, and he said, this is something I believe but cannot prove. And he said that he believed that as beings of consciousness, we have an existence to go on to when this material body expires. And he said, some of us struggle to make that transition. If we are very attached to this material life through strong emotion, heavier emotions, he called them, things like rage, resentment, unfulfilled ambition, trauma, fear, or even passionate love. He believed all those things could delay our transition from this material experience to the next phase of our experience as beings of consciousness. And he said, those of us who take a while to leave are sometimes experienced as ghosts. And I wonder if that explanation would give some way of understanding one or two of the stories I'm now going to share. Bobby was taking a road trip with his young daughter. As they drove through a particular area, he noticed in the rearview mirror he could see his daughter having a conversation with an invisible friend. Now, his daughter was only 5 or 6 years old at the time, so it wasn't so unusual to see his daughter talking to herself, but he just observed as his daughter interacted with this invisible friend. Now, initially, it seemed to have all the dynamics of a playful conversation between two youngsters. They seemed to be sharing stories, laughing and giggling. And then he saw his daughter listening intently with a look of concern and compassion on her face, and then a look of some sorrow. And as he was puzzling over this strange experience going on in the back of his car, he just sort of reassured his daughter and said, we'll pull over shortly. We'll take a break, we'll get some refreshments, we'll stretch our legs a bit. And so that's what they did. When they stopped and he was walking with his daughter, he wasn't pressing her for details of the conversation, but he just allowed her to talk about it. And she said that she'd got in conversation with a Native American boy. And he told of his life in that area, how he lived there with his family and his tribe, until a band of marauding men arrived one day who wanted the land and the water that his tribe possessed, and they proceeded to slaughter the tribe. The boy said that he saw his own family killed in front of him, and then they saw him some distance from the cab, and they came to him and killed him, and he said his death was very painful. Well, this was in the days before the internet, so Bobby had no way of confirming this story quickly, and he took some time going through the records of the local library, then the county library, and eventually he went to a national archive to look through records that related to this area they'd been driving through. And one by one, all the details of his daughter's story were confirmed for that location. 100 years ago, there was a tribe that had been massacred in that area, and part of the find included a boy's body some distance from the camp, and he had been brutally killed. Now, these were things that his daughter could not possibly know. They didn't live in that area. They were just passing through. She was only 5 or 6 years old, and yet every detail had been confirmed. Bobby felt he needed to do something about what his daughter had heard, at least to help her process this sad story, to do something about what they'd heard. And so they went back to the area and they offered up prayers for the boy and his family. He thought at least this would help his daughter, and maybe in some way it would honor the memories that the boy had shared with his daughter in that car all those months before. Now, I find that story very interesting because through my career in ministry, 33 years in church-based ministry, I have been involved in hundreds of funerals. And so I've had to do some thinking about what a funeral is and what it means. And through the years, I came to believe that funerals matter to the bereaved and to the deceased. And that sometimes we need to do things to honor those who have died, to help lay them to rest, to help them with their transition. So I resonate with what Bobby said there about needing to do something to help that boy find peace. He, at the very least, wanted his story known, and so shared it with a girl who was young enough to be receptive to his presence as they drove through that area. Now, Bobby's story would be an example of someone who has struggled to transition because their passing was very traumatic, and the fear and the sorrow of his passing was holding him to that place. But sometimes maybe we transition more slowly because we're held to this material realm by love. We love being around our loved ones and we don't want to rush away. Patricia shared with me the story of what happened when her dad passed away. And shortly after he had died, she started having this experience at about 3 o'clock in the morning. She'd be lying asleep until the feeling of somebody ruffling her hair. And that's exactly what her dad used to do when she was a little girl. When he came to check on her at night, he would always ruffle her hair. And she felt this was the spirit of her dad visiting her, just wanting to be around her, and maybe wanting to comfort her in some way as well. And it wasn't just the feeling of ruffled hair, but the smell of the germaline ointment that he always used to use on his hands. And that continued for some time after her father passed away. Now, if you listen to people who have near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences, what they often say is that when the consciousness comes out of the body, time no longer means everything. Everything is happening all at once. And at the very least, time doesn't mean what it means when we're in the body. And so this is just me speculating, but I can imagine when I pass on, I might say, well, before I move on, I just want to check on the kids, just want to see that they're okay. And so if time doesn't mean anything, I might have an experience that feels to me in my post-mortem existence like an hour and I'm just checking on my kids. But in material time, that could be 7 generations. 7 generations of people feeling ruffled hair or smelling germaline or whatever the equivalent is, because I'm watching over my progeny. There are many Native American traditions that speak of our needing to watch over our progeny 7 generations into the future, to make our decisions with our 7 future generations in mind. And so I wonder about that. There is a verse in the New Testament, in the book of Hebrews, that talks about the spirits of our ancestors watching over us, very concerned and interested in our progress through life. So I can relate to that. I've lost count of the number of Christian friends I have who've had experiences of red cardinals visiting them after a loved one passes away. Now, there is nothing in the Bible that talks about the spirits of our loved ones visiting us as red cardinals. So they had no reason to have that idea, think that up, or imagine that was the case when a red cardinal showed up in their garden. But a number of people have told me they started being visited by a red cardinal after a loved one had passed away, and they began feeling they were being watched by the loved one who had gone on. Now, this next story might not be a ghost story at all, but the story of some kind of a temporal anomaly. The story told me by a friend of mine who has shared this story a couple of times on his own radio show. It's not something he speaks about very often because it just seems so incredible and people don't know what to do with it. But this is a friend of mine who had this experience. He was on a driving trip with his teenage boys when they saw a sign saying burgers, $1. And it was like a turnoff off the highway about a mile down the road. So they turn off the highway, they go into the parking lot of this hamburger place, and sure enough, it says they're $1 each. His son said, "We've got to stop. We could have 2 burgers at that price." And when they pulled into the parking lot, my friend noticed that the cars were all really old stock. And he thought, gee, we're only 3 minutes off the highway here, and it looks like we're in the backwoods. Look how old these cars are. And then they went in to the burger place, and everyone inside, he said, was dressed like his grandparents. Again, and he thought, how rural is this place that people are dressed like this? And they had their dinner and felt a little bit uncomfortable, a little bit stared at, but the food was good. And they had their meal, they got in the car, and they drove away. A year later, my friend was on the same route, and he wanted to find that cafe because the experience had just been so odd. He couldn't find it. He pulled off at that same turnoff. He couldn't find the cafe. So he stopped at the nearest little run of shops to where that cafe was, and he said, "I'm looking for the burger place that does burgers for $1. And a lady pointed to the building just further down the street. She said, "But honey, that place has been closed for years. It burned down years ago." And sure enough, when he went and checked it out, the building hadn't been used in a long time. It had clearly been destroyed in a fire many years before. Now again, that's not a ghost story. That's some kind of a temporal anomaly. He had been traveling in his car. He was traveling through space, and yet somehow they'd traveled to a different time and then got back to their own time. I often wonder what would happen if they'd taken a different route back onto the highway, because then it wouldn't be an anomalous story. It would be a story of missing people. But I just wonder if time really is not what we think it is, if everything really is happening all at once. It would give some explanation as to how bizarre, anomalous things like that can happen. He's a friend of mine. You might struggle to process that just as I do. But again, let me know what you think in the comments. If you had an experience like that, you have an opinion on these things, a theory as to how these things might actually work. In 33 years of church ministry, I had my fair share of paranormal experiences, and like many ministers, pastors and priests, had to be involved in entity removal from time to time. But for the most part, I don't have the kind of gift that is able to see people moving around after they've passed, and I'm really quite grateful for that. But we were quite recently considering the possibility of buying a house that was on an old cemetery. And we were open to the idea. In the end, we decided not to, not because we were frightened of what might happen, partly because resale value, but partly because we felt that our kids are sensitive enough that they and our pets would be seeing things all the time, whether place echo or people who've not transitioned, so we decided not to. So I'd be very interested in your comment on that. Another of my viewers, Strider, thank you for this story, told me what happened when his father passed away. Now, his father was gravely ill in hospital, and they knew that his passing was probably coming. And then one evening, his mother and his brother returned home from the hospital, and his mom said, "I'm so sorry, honey, your dad has passed." And Strider said, "What do you mean? He just walked in the door with you and closed the door behind him." Now, there was other family present. And what was interesting was that his mom didn't correct him or say, "Oh, honey, I'm sorry," and see this as grief or denial. She covered for him because she knew that he had seen him walk in. Just something about her awareness and her awareness of her son showed her, oh, he really did see something. And sure enough, when it came time for the funeral, at the end of the funeral, Strider said to his mum, "You know, Dad was sitting right at the back of the service all the way through." And she said, "Yes, I sensed him too." And so there was again a sensitivity in the family. Now, a lot of people have experiences of sensitivity to loved ones when they pass. They might have no awareness of other people after they passed, but they'll get a visit from their loved one on the night that they pass. That kind of experience. Last year, I did a video where I shared the story of a friend of mine who lived in an old rectory in East Anglia in Great Britain. And they started having the experience of looking through the window from their kitchen out into the garden, and the window was by the sink. And they kept seeing this nun staring back at them through the window, holding her face as if in agony. They didn't know what this meant until the time came. They were building an extension on the house, and they were excavating the patio outside the kitchen window. And when they did that, they found the remains of a nun who had lived there hundreds of years before, with a whole portion of her face eaten away by a horrible cancer, which would have been absolutely excruciating. Well, what my friend's dad did when they discovered the remains was to give her a burial and to pray for her, to do a funeral for her. And when they did that, the visitations stopped. And again, this is one of those experiences that has suggested to me that a funeral really is something to help the deceased person to transition, just as much as it is for the family who are bereaved to grieve their loved one who's passed on. And so in the funerals I've done in more recent years, I always say to the family, when you plan the service, I want you to assume that your loved one is there and can see everything and hear everything. So when you plan it for them, to honor them, to please them, to help them feel at peace and able to move on. And I found that a very helpful way of approaching funerals and helping people to plan them. And I have come to believe that is the case, that those who pass on want to be remembered, they want to be honored, and sometimes we need to help them move on. A personal experience that illustrates this was of my gran. Now, my gran died in hospital and they weren't quite sure what she had died of. And so there had to be a coroner's report on the cause of death. And that delayed for a few days the time frame for her funeral. Now, my gran's next door neighbor, Kathy, didn't know anything about this. She knew that my gran had gone into hospital and she knew that she'd died in hospital. And then Kathy had a dream. And in the dream, Kathy met my gran at a bus stop, which is a classic metaphor for someone transitioning. And my gran sitting at the bus stop waiting for the bus. And Kathy says to my gran, "Oh, Mrs. Jordan, what are you doing here? You shouldn't be here." Because in the dream, Kathy was aware that my gran had died. "You shouldn't be here." And my gran said to Kathy, "Oh no, I'm not allowed to go yet. They have to find out what I died of before I'm allowed to go on." Now, Kathy knew nothing about the fact that we were waiting for the coroner's report on cause of death before we could have the funeral. And so that experience suggested to me that what we do does affect those who go before us in their transition. And it made me think, wow, is it possible that the consciousness of my gran was communicating with Kathy's consciousness in her dream state? I really believe that is what was happening. In the New Testament, in the book of Hebrews, chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, we have a very interesting moment. Now, it's preceded by a whole chapter of recollections of those who've gone before us, our spiritual ancestors, and the writer lists all the various things they did that were great and inspiring and impressive. And then he said, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. Now, he doesn't say since we're preceded by, he says surrounded by. And he says we're surrounded by witnesses. That means they're watching us, they're conscious of us, and they're very interested in how we are running the race marked out for us. It is something known by shamanic healers all around the world that our ancestors are concerned for our well-being. And often if you go for a healing ceremony with a shamanic healer, they will expect to hear messages from your invisible cloud of supporters to aid you in your healing and your progress through life. And by invisible cloud of supporters, they mean the ancestors, the spirits. And there it is, right in the roots of primitive Christianity, Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. Since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses. So I think Patricia's dad, ruffling her hair in the middle of the night, was a witness, watching over her, wishing her well in her progress through life. This too was part of what Plato had to say about our ancestors. He believed that when our conscious being transcends our material being, when our body expires, that we are helped in our transition by other entities. And he believed that these entities might sometimes or always be ancestors, people who have gone before us, who love us, who have watched over us, and want to help us when our moment of transition comes. It seems to be a two-way street, that our ancestors wish to help us, but they also want to be remembered and honored in the way the writer of Hebrews does in Hebrews 11, honoring the contribution of all those who've gone before. They want their stories told. They want us to know what happened to them. That little boy in Bobby's car wanted the little girl to know what had happened to him. They want us to honor them and remember them, but they're also concerned with us and our well-being and our progress through life. So I really think we surround each other, and maybe that insight of those who have near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences who say that time doesn't exist, everything's happening all at once, maybe that's quite a helpful insight with which to go through life. But I would love to know what you think. Have you had any experience like this? Do you have a view on the stories that I've told? Have you experienced ghosts or time warps or place echoes? Have you had an experience like that? Do you have an opinion on these things, a theory as to how these things might actually work? Thanks for watching this time around. I'll look forward to joining in the discussion in the comments.